Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, the panel has assembled for the next session called The Racial Divide. Think of these four people as sitting on the news headlines that you've been reading every day or the news bulletins on television. And that's what we should hear. Let me introduce the moderator who's sitting at the far side. He's a remarkable man. I had the pleasure of, alas, too short a conversation with him here last year. He has, among other things, a beautiful gift of the English language. He's a pleasure to listen to. He's a much admired man of many accomplishments. He's the president of the Ford Foundation, and this is probably the only occasion this weekend when he'll be on a stage when somebody won't ask him for something, because he's one of the biggest philanthropists in the country. He's a recognized visionary when it comes to philanthropy. Time magazine named him to its annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. They could have said the 10 most influential people in America. The list of his achievements is long and long and long. This is Darren Walker.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Kent, Connecticut. The brilliant Ben Rosen and his incandescent wife, Donna. Thank you, Ben and Donna, for bringing it back again and bringing us all together in this really special, magical place. The racial divide. We have three remarkable people who are going to share with you, I think, unique perspectives that they each bring to something that increasingly, according to the polls, most Americans believe we do have a problem with, and that is the issue of race relations in America. The three distinguished panelists you'll be hearing from, to my right, the District Attorney of New York City, Cyrus Vance, Jr. Thank you. Kristen Clarke, the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. And Ekow Yankah, the Distinguished Professor of Law at Cardozo School of Law. Welcome. So let's get right down to it. The challenge of race in America has, in many ways, confounded and served as a contradiction to the very existence of America. Our ideals as a nation of opportunity and freedom for all are in fact contradicted by the facts of our history, the codification in the Constitution that some Americans, African Americans, were in fact not free, nor were they fully human. In fact, our Constitution said that the slaves were 3/5 of a human being, and that we have at the same time the language of our Constitution that so inspires, motivates the noblest of language. And so the challenge for us today is to reconcile the noble, mythologized America with the reality that many Americans live. So I'm going to start with you, Ekow, because there's something I've always admired and looked forward to your writings, and particularly when you write those very searing op-eds in the Times, because today we are in this conversation about something that one on its face would appear to be a very perfunctory statement. And that is the statement that Black lives matter. And yet, it has become such a contested statement. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers. As anybody who's ever thrown a dinner party knows, it takes an unbelievable amount of work to make things look effortless, and this just looks effortless. So thank you for all of that work. I think it's a tough question. Look, so Black Lives Matter at its best should be something we're all grateful for, that a group of young people, after being called apathetic for half a generation, have gathered themselves into a political movement. But the worries and the claims of this movement are so broad and so important that I think there's an impulse for people to simplify it. Now, you would think simplifying it would be a way of understanding it, but sadly, I think people want to simplify it in order to dismiss it, right? So I'll just speak as plainly as is possible for a law professor. Look, so if the claim that people want is Black Lives Matter is against police because they claim police wake up every day wanting to shoot black people, that's an easy claim to dismiss, right? Which is the kind of claim you hear opponents or, let's say at least resistors, put into the mouths of advocates. So I think the easiest thing to do is to actually zoom in on the particular and work out to the general, which is counterintuitive. So the particular is we see a shooting. We see a shooting on television captured by a video by happenstance. And we say, okay, that cop is a bad apple. And what the Black Lives Matter movement asks us to do is take a step back, right? Let's talk about the shootings that don't appear on TV or don't appear captured by video. Why is it that when those shootings happen and somebody says, but that's the way the police describe it isn't the way it happened, nobody believes them unless there's a video? Why is it that we think that, my God, in the last 2 years, these unbelievable things have happened? Why should we think that the last 2 years have been any different from the 20, 30, 40, 50 years before that? Except for that, we have video cameras now. And then we take a step back from that. When communities have said, we've been experiencing the oppressive ability of the police to do what they want, when they want to us for a long time, harassing us and using us to fund community coffers. The DOJ goes into Ferguson or Baltimore and says, look, they were telling the truth all the time, right? And people don't want to hear that. And then you take a step back and on and on. You take a step back if you're a law professor, you notice that the laws allow the police to do this. The Supreme Court has turned a blind eye to the way we allow police to stop people on a pretext, knowing full well this will be used to police communities of color differently. And then you can take a step all the way back to pay back the compliment, your wonderful op-ed in the New York Times, speaking about the ways in which we ignore even something as innocent as internships and how they help advance those who have more. And so it's every time you take a step back, the movement says, are you noticing the way black lives are not counting fully? And it's only if you want to say, if you want to cheapen the message to the racist is the person who wakes up trying to kill black people, that they're easy to dismiss. And I think it's that invitation to take a step back.
But isn't it reasonable that some people would say, well, of course Black lives matter, but all lives matter? And I think that's a reasonable statement too that has also become contested.
I find this obnoxious, actually. I'm not sympathetic enough. And by the way, you know, I tend to come off, oddly enough, people call me, I'm deeply touched when people say I write searing things. Because I think I write the plainest, I think I'm actually very quiet. I mean, the people I know who are upset, they write searing things. I say the quietest things and I still get sort of hate mail, right? Here's why it's obnoxious. Imagine, let's take a less contested area. Imagine we were talking about rape, okay? We know what rape looks like. We know we now know more about what rape looks like. We know that often it's not strangers in dark alleys. We know it's people that women know. We know it's college campuses. We know it's vastly underreported. And we know that young women are raped at rates that would be staggering. Now imagine a young woman said to us, it is time for us to protect women because raping women is wrong. And we stood up and said, raping anybody's wrong. I mean, how obnoxious is that? Of course it's taken that raping a man is wrong. And if we're talking about highly specialized areas like prisons, for example, or war zones, we'd be really interested in that. But to say that something affects a small group in this vastly disproportionate way, but let's not focus on that, let's talk about how it affects me, is so insensitive. It borders on dismissive cruelty, actually. And so I have no patience for this.
Thank you. Kristen Clarke, you lead one of the most venerable civil rights organizations in the United States. How do you see this from your perch?
Well, thank God for the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that the courage of so many young people who are speaking up about a problem that we've long known has existed, but has now been thrust into the spotlight by videos that are going viral and by our smartphones, I think is helping to kind of transform the landscape. It's put us all into a box. We can no longer ignore a problem that's been right in front of us for decades. And the Black Lives Matter movement is helping to shine a spotlight on these issues and make sure that people are not just angry today, but they're angry tomorrow, and they're angry next week, and they're angry a month from now, and angry and remaining angry until we achieve reform. The reality is that there is still so much work to do. There is so much that is broken about our approach to law enforcement in this country. It is rare that officers who use excessive force or use deadly force against African Americans or minority groups are held accountable for their actions. It is rare that we see police departments taking a step back and saying, yes, you know what, we are ready to deal with the biases that pervade our ranks. We are ready to institute implicit bias training. We are ready to purge the officers from our ranks who engage in and have a long pattern of abuse against minority communities. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. And I am thankful for the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think that they are a critical part in making sure that we, once and for all confront the problem of police abuse in a real and meaningful way.
But isn't there a downside to what some people believe is really an excessive, almost over magnification of the problem, so that we label law enforcement as bad? Isn't there a risk in a democracy that relies on its institutions, particularly its justice institutions, for activists and advocates to, in some ways, create narratives that are so pervasive that actually can be harmful to law enforcement?
Well, we're not over-magnifying a problem when there are people out on the streets dying. But I think that you're right, that it would be incredibly reductionist on our part to label all law enforcement as bad. There are good cops out there, many of them, who are dedicated public servants committed to promoting public safety. They are the people we turn to when we are in need of help. But the reality is that there's some bad apples that pervade their ranks, and not enough police departments and sheriff's offices with the courage and political will to purge those bad apples from their ranks, resulting in the death, the loss of life, the long-term impact that we see on communities and on the families that have lost victims. So I fully agree with you, and I would never dismiss or label all law enforcement as bad. I think that it's the exact opposite. I'm very interested in figuring out how we have these conversations with and alongside law enforcement. The one thing that I'm quite fearful of is law enforcement with the political will to bring about reform, trying to do that on their own. I think that it is very important that community leaders and advocates and civil rights voices be at the table working alongside law enforcement to address these issues.
Speaking of courageous public servants, Cyrus Vance. So you have initiated a number of courageous efforts, interventions in the DA's office, implicit bias training, longitudinal research that I think has revealed some very interesting things you might want to talk about in terms of the history of the District Attorney's Office in New York City that are troubling. How do you address the issue as a leader in our justice system, in one part of a justice system that many, the scholar Michelle Alexander has labeled the entire system is racist And law enforcement is but one mechanism for controlling of particularly communities of color.
I think to follow up on the earlier comments, this isn't just a police issue, it's a prosecution issue as well. And I think that politically there is just a beginning to have an appreciation about the importance of prosecutors in their handling of issues that relate to race and criminal justice. So for the audience and for others, I think who is your prosecutor, that decision and whom you elect is going to be the person who either plays a leadership role on this issue or doesn't fill that leadership need. So from my perspective, Darren, what drove this almost carefully to me is I was running for DA in 2009. Stop and frisk in New York was at about 680,000 people stopped a year. And I was often asked about what I thought about stop and frisk, and I had personal opinions. I thought it was excessive numbers of stops to achieve the amount of crime reduction that it did. And so I felt that if I were elected DA, that really I ought to know if I took over this office, how was the Manhattan DA's office doing? Otherwise, I felt I would be criticizing other agencies without knowing the status of our own agency. So I made a commitment I would bring the Vera Institute of Justice in, and that's a great think tank on criminal justice based out of New York. And so my response was to do a diagnostic of our office, which you call a longitudinal study, and bring Vera in to do a racial bias review of the Manhattan DA's office's policies on plea bargaining, sentencing, bail recommendations, and the like. And what made it so obvious for me to know that we needed to do this is, I think back when I was a young assistant district attorney in 1982 in the DA's office in Manhattan, and you could not see that the people who were coming into court night after night when you were working in night court, overwhelmingly men and women of color. It's startling, it's obvious, and you have to ask the question, why is this? When I came back to the DA's office almost 25 or 30 years later, and I was in court, I saw virtually the same picture that I'd seen in 1982. Those people in court, overwhelmingly men and women of color. So how is it that picture still looks the same? And my question was, and I think the question for any head lawyer is, and what do we do about it? So the first thing was to bring Vera in and help us understand if there were statistically significant differences between equally situated folks, where were they? And Vera came in and it identified some statistically significant variations between how certain case outcomes occurred between African Americans, whites, Latinos, and Asians. And I was very happy to have that information. I'm asked often if I was upset by it, and I say no. I think the far greater shame is not asking the question.
But what did the data reveal?
The data revealed that there were statistically significant differences in the sentences and between African Americans, whites, and Latinos, a fairly narrow range. But the main thing is it gave me information that I could then act on. And this November, we will have redone that statistical analysis to understand have we improved or have we not improved. But what was the most important point from the Vera study to me is where it enabled us to then lead the office. And it was that in our office, the police, we have 100,000 cases a year, huge number of cases, and we write up as an office most of the cases, overwhelming percentage that the police bring to us. We start a case if there's probable cause. And I really began to believe that the way to change the picture of who's coming into court, young men and women of color predominantly, is to focus heavily on trying to divert the appropriate individuals from not coming into court at all, focusing on nonviolent, low-level offenses with individuals with minor criminal records, and trying to essentially move those cases out of the courtroom process with arrest and arraignments and all the negatives that follow from engaging in that process to diversion at the precinct and the opportunity for tens of thousands of men and women to do community service to deal with some misconduct that they apparently have done, as opposed to arrest and arraignment. And so that's, Darren, how I decided to try to change the picture, trying to get less young men and women in court to begin with, because I feel the outcomes may be better with these diversion approaches, and I think it is a fairer approach, a more sensible, appropriate use of resources, and I think we can do so without sacrificing public safety.
Well, I think I think it's fair to say that you are rare. There are not a lot of district attorneys across the country engaging in the kind of intervention that you just described. In part, it's because district attorneys are elected by the public, and in many places, the public want law and order.
Right.
And so district attorneys are running on law and order platforms. And so part of, I think, the challenge is the reform needs to come from within, but people are elected on platforms that in many ways are anti-reform.
Yeah. So let me jump and then open it up. I think this is an incredibly important moment and an opportune moment for law enforcement. Rather than a time for us to despair about despair, it is the time to lead, whether you're a police chief or a precinct captain or a DA, and to take the issue head on. There is bias in our justice system. It's not really an issue. There's implicit bias in all of us who work in the working world. There's no point arguing that. It's a scientific fact. The question is, how are we going to take race on so that we can move through it, as opposed to be overcome by the issue? And I think that's really what we should be asking for our leaders of public institutions is to acknowledge that this is an issue that we need to address. We need to be transparent about how we're addressing it. We cannot be afraid of it. And if we don't acknowledge it and if we don't deal with it, it not only will be a lost opportunity, but I think ultimately those folks who don't understand that they have to lead through this are going to be the ones who are no longer going to be running offices.
So then let's talk about solutions, because I think for a lot of people, particularly white people, the conversation is challenging because what do you want? I mean, what's the solution? How do we get out of this confounding circumstance that in some ways began generations ago? And many people feel, as someone said to me recently, during the time of slavery, my family was in South Sicily. I mean, we had nothing to do with what was going on in the United States and the evils of slavery. And so why am I being held accountable for something that in many ways my forebears had really nothing to do with? So I guess solutions are really hard to come by because what we hear so often are the grievances of African Americans about what is wrong. I'd like both of you to talk about what you see as a solution set. Of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about his view. Solutions are reparations and a manifesto that includes a very clearly articulated set of interventions, and most recently, the Movement for Black Lives published a very long manifesto that is filled with very clear set of demands for change in America to redress these historic wrongs. What do you two think about that? Ekow.
So if I had an easy solution, I would not keep it to myself. Look, so I do think, I hate to be quippish, but I'll do it for effect and then try to be explanatory. I think it'd be helpful if people treated black people the way they would treat white people, right? Which sounds quippish, but I mean to say, part of what we require is real moral imagination, the real effort, the real genuine effort to try to see in each other something like a person, like a genuine, real person. So for example, you were mentioning rightfully that people say they want law and order, but I'm deeply suspicious that people really want law and order, right? So people say they want law and order, but in fact, as you know, crime rates are at historic lows for reasons that criminologists find very hard to understand. Crime has never been lower, not counting last year, than it is today in recorded American history, as far as I know, as far as the people who study these things know. So it's hard to know what people mean by they want more law and order. It's also true that when there are problems that affect people you recognize, people do not call for law and order, right? When your child's school is going through trouble, you don't say, you know what I'd really like? 10 new police officers roaming the hallways. You say, what's going on? What went wrong? What can we fix? Where do we invest in? What school counselors can we use, et cetera, et cetera? And maybe then a police officer. You know, the example I wrote about recently in another op-ed was the distinction currently, the massive difference in response between the current stunning and heartbreaking epidemic in opiates and heroin than the same response you saw when Black America was suffering with crack. So nobody's saying that the current response is either adequate or perfect. What is true is there's a massive national conversation about how to save souls, how to help people who fall into the grip of addiction, how to make sure they get help. You have police chiefs talking about carrying antidote drugs, about getting people into rehab, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's speaking about law and order. Police chiefs are out there saying, we have to recognize that crime is a symptom of addiction. And I have people giving me all these counter arguments about violence, but here's what's not happening. We are not leaving a community abandoned, without resources, without investment, without rehab, waiting for 5 years for violence to metastasize, for an underground economy to be massively invested in selling death, and then coming in with a police force and saying, well, there's nothing we can do, right? So that's to say, it's very easy for people to say they want law and order, but when people see those who they recognize as people, then we find the imagination to do something about how we save them, how we invest in them, how we care about communities. And if we drove ourselves to say, gosh, this school is failing, how would I actually treat this school if these children look like children I recognized? If we really made ourselves to do that.
Kristen.
So I'm going to hit off a few practical points that I think are areas where we need to really focus attention and energy if we want to bring about real transformative change. One, I want to pick up on voting rights. Our organization does a great deal of work to protect the right to vote, the most important right in our democracy. And I think we touched on this a little bit, but the power of the vote as a tool for bringing about criminal justice reform cannot be underscored enough at this moment. It's 2016, and we have a lot of folks who are very focused on the presidential election, but we need focus all the way down the ballot. Two, as District Attorney Vance notes, district attorney positions. District attorney positions matter because they have the power to decide whether or not to prosecute that bad cop who used deadly force without basis in their community. Mayors matter because they are the ones who often seat police chiefs. Sheriffs matter. 99% of the sheriffs across our country are elected officials. So we need to be talking about the right to vote as an important tool for achieving criminal justice reform. So that's point one. Two, police departments across our country do not reflect the racial diversity of the communities they serve, from the top all the way down to the bottom. And there has not been enough focus on the failure of police departments to do a better job when it comes to recruiting people of color, people who are limited English proficient, to make sure that police departments are really able to gain the trust of the communities they serve and are really able to meet the needs of the people that they are there and sworn to protect and serve. Three, the President Obama convened a task force several years ago that resulted in a remarkable report, the 21st Century Report on Policing Reform. Any idea, that sensible idea for achieving policing reform and to help police overcome this problem of race is in this report. The challenge is figuring out how do we get police departments to a place where they are open, receptive to instituting those reforms. And I think that is a huge challenge. How do we incentivize police departments to do better, to want to do better? One issue that doesn't get talked about a lot, I think, is the problems that police departments face with unionized workforces, collective bargaining agreements that make them just culturally resistant to ideas of disciplining bad officers, purging bad officers from their ranks. So that has to be a part of the conversation. I think accountability is key. What can we do to make sure that when bad officers do bad things that they are held accountable? What do we do to send the message to them that they are not above the law? I think that we need more district attorneys out there with the courage to pursue these cases. I think we need to think about independent prosecutors and how they might be a resource, right? It's challenging for some district attorneys, I think, to look at these cases with the appropriate distance. They work alongside cops every day. How do you make a fair and impartial decision to investigate and prosecute a cop who you know and work with all the time? And what can we do to equip the feds, the Justice Department, with the ability to do these cases? There's a really bad single federal statute that has a burden of proof standard that's just about impossible to overcome. But with more high-profile prosecutions at the federal level, I think that we can send a message to cops that you should think before you pull that trigger, because there could be consequences. I could go on and on, but the last point I'll leave you with is this. I think that for us at the Lawyers Committee and for many historic civil rights organizations, fighting for justice and reform is kind of what we do every day, but we need more partners. We need more unusual suspects alongside us championing the need for policing reform. And so if we can figure out how we can achieve a broader, robust, cross-racial coalition pushing for reform, I think we can overcome some of the obstacles that we face when it comes to pushing some of these ideas for change.
So, Cyrus Vance, you are white, and I have a question for you. Is it fair to say that there are a lot of people, white people, who want to engage on this issue and want to contribute to solutions and reconciliation, but that to engage is really a fraught, problematic, challenging, high-risk activity? Because we have seen examples of well-meaning whites who have attempted to engage and used the wrong language and been vilified in the media. Some even lost their jobs. Certainly their own sense of commitment to the issue was called into question when in fact they were trying to help. Do we need to have safe spaces for white people?
I really, I appreciate the thrust of the question, but I think that that's what you sign up for when you decide you're going to be a district attorney and make decisions that affect people's lives as a line assistant or be an elected DA. Our job, and I think it is heartfelt by almost all the lawyers I know, is we really are trying to do the right thing in every case. And obviously what we need to do is, and what our office is doing, is educating our lawyers about bias and about how it can play out in their case assessments and how they can avoid it and be sensitive to it. But I guess I'd say, to answer your question, I think as a white person, you have to be careful of your vocabulary, like any person, sensitive person would be, if talking about issues that affect race. It's not being scared of race, it's just that you can cause damage even if you're well-intentioned by not understanding the sensitivities that go along with addressing these issues in your workforce.
But shouldn't, I mean, that's really, I mean, that's a hard pronouncement. So, you know, the burden is on you as a white person to have the level of sensitivity to know that you could be ignorant and say the wrong thing and then get into trouble. And I mean, is that fair?
I don't think that's that difficult with how we deal with everything in our daily lives. I think race is just it's a deep ingrained problem in our history that has been played out in our criminal justice system. It's also played out in our education system and our employment system. And by the way, how do you stop and how do you reduce crime in America? By providing equal opportunity for education, by providing equal opportunity for employment. And those two things alone, in the hands of presidents and senators and congressmen and women, have more impact on race in America than a district attorney's office will ever have. And so it's, you know, that's where the answer lies, in my view. By the time people get to a DA's office, no matter how proactive we are, and we are, you know, we've got so many investments in community engagement and activity now. At the end of the day, our focus as DAs has got to be shifting just from not just to prosecute, but to prevent crime. And I think that's the biggest shift in prosecution that I support and that I've seen in the last 6 or 7 years, is that if we asked anyone in this audience if you could keep a gun out of a 16-year-old young man's hand so that he wouldn't be able to either to get in trouble or shoot somebody or shoot himself, that's a far better outcome than prosecuting him for having that gun. And so we focus now very much on crime prevention strategies as a crime fighting strategy. But on the question of risk, I was talking to Kristen just upstairs. I raised, you know, these issues. The tragedies around America have been so powerful over just look at the last 3 months, let alone the years, that I felt I had to go talk to the assistants in the office. We have 600 lawyers to bring them together and to talk about race and to talk about what we're doing in our office to address this issue, and to have them be able to talk about it. So it is fraught because there are not that many groups of professionals who get together and talk about these personal issues that can bring up a lot of hurt and a lot of anger. My point, though, is that's exactly why we have to do it. And so whether I'm a white person or whatever, you know, wherever I am, if you have a problem that's this big, the way to address it is, I think, with sensitivity, but directly. And then if they see that you are prepared to talk about this, then that will enable the office to talk about it, and that creates an environment that enables the institution to be more stable as it moves through it.
So I want to go back to something you said. Earlier you referenced the data point around crime being at historic lows, and that is true generally. However, there are places like Chicago. And so let's talk about Chicago and what's going on the South Side. And not only in Chicago, but let's isolate that example, because there are many who have said that in some ways the efforts of people like you and Kristen to bring attention to the injuries of law enforcement distracts us from the injuries of crime happening in African American communities committed by African Americans on other African Americans. And so, of course, we heard during one of the conventions a very impassioned speech that I think spoke to this sentiment that African American leaders and activists, scholars, people like yourselves should actually be focused on black crime and what is happening in places like Chicago. What do you say to that?
Well, so there's a part of that that's just pure condescension. So, you know, one stat that people are very happy to trot out is that something like it's just above 90% of violent crime, that violent crime that African Americans experience is committed by African Americans. It also happens to be true that something just above 85% of violent crime that white people experience is by white people, right? We live in the most segregated time we've ever lived in America. Not ever. We live in the most segregated time we've lived in, including if you go all the way beyond Jim Crow, right? So I'm not historical enough to know. I imagine slavery was worse, but we live in a very segregated country. People harm those they know, those they live with, they rob people of opportunity, and there's nothing particular about the fact that crime is interracial. That being said, it is very true that African American communities, particularly poor African American communities and Hispanic communities, suffer disproportionate crime. And we should take that seriously. The part I find condescending is the idea that somehow, I mean, there are two parts that are condescending, that somehow black activists are unconcerned with this. I mean, that just takes a sort of willful blindness. I mean, Kristen knows, I'm sure Cyrus Vance knows, I cannot tell you how much time one spends in church groups speaking about how to help a community that suffered a recent shooting, how much time you get together with civic organizations that talk about getting guns off the streets, getting kids into, I mean, it goes all the way down to whether or not you can start a new Big Brothers and Big Sisters organization. The black community, like any community, is incredibly focused on its health and well-being. Nobody cares more about the violence in black communities than black people. So there's just a rank, willful blindness and condescension to pretending that somehow that we can't think of two things at once, that we can't worry about. There's enough worry to go around. Lastly, even if all that was true, I understand the rhetorical power of the point. If I were in such a position and had, forgive me, just speak bluntly, if I were totally callous, I would make the point too. Okay. But the idea that anybody would say that the answer to a community suffering from outsized violence and crime is to allow unchecked racially motivated policing is insanity. No community would invite that as a cure, as though somehow being treated worse by the police will help. Look, I spend a lot of times when I have the time, I have two small kids now, so I don't spend a lot of time doing anything, but when I have the time, I spend a lot of time speaking to different organizations, in particular about policing. Black people don't want worse policing. They don't want more policing. They want better policing. That's what every community wants. And that's what you see when communities are, as I used the example earlier, when communities are affected with crime, what they want is help, not more militarized policing. So I think it's a cheap rhetorical tool. I am in total agreement with those of goodwill who say we have to also concentrate on Black Lives Mattering when they're gunned down meaninglessly in black-on-black violence. But to pretend that this is to the exclusion of worrying about unjust policing is bizarre.
Kristen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When you look at the NYPD's stop and frisk program at its height, about 6% of stops resulted in arrest. When you looked deeper into the numbers, about 0.01% of the stops resulted in a conviction for a crime involving possession of a deadly weapon. About 0.01% of all stops resulted in a conviction for a dangerous assault. The Justice Department just last week put out a report on Baltimore's policing practices, which I think are far worse than what was going on in New York City. About 3% of arrests of stops conducted on the streets of Baltimore, many of them in black neighborhoods, resulted in arrest. Who knows how many of those actually made it to the courthouse door or resulted in convictions. What we need is effective policing. Crime is a bad thing. Nobody wants to live in a crime-ridden community. But when you have police carrying out their jobs in such poor ways and in such racialized ways, it's a problem. We ignore the dignity of minority communities when we say that this is acceptable. I am the mother of a 12-year-old son, and I hate that I have had to have the talk with my little boy, the talk about what he should do if ever stopped by the police, what he should do to reduce the likelihood that he's ever stopped by the cops. So,
So because you think that a white mother of a 12-year-old boy doesn't have to have talks like that?
I don't think bears the same burden. I could be wrong, but I don't think bears the burden in the same way. You know, after Eric Garner, my son was at school playing with another little black boy after school, and a white girl came up to them and said, "Shut up before I put an Eric Garner chokehold on you." And, you know, I think that we have to think about, you know, the impact that poor policing and racialized policing has on communities.
Great. So we're going to go to questions. We've got about 15 minutes. So we've got Q&A here for this great panel. And I think the lights are going to go up, and there should be mics. And this is certainly not a crowd of wilting flowers. So please raise your hand, identify yourself. And we have a question here. Yes, ma'am, we'll pass it to you. Identify yourself. And this is a question and answer session.
Yes. Thank you for an excellent panel first. I think this was superb. And in terms of better, more effective policing, less racialized policing, there's some data out there now, pretty significant, that shows that women police officers are substantially less likely to use excessive force, to misinterpret situations and apply unnecessary force, and to use deadly force. Would each of you please comment on what it would take to have a national plan, a national proposal, national funding to make all police forces in the United States at every level 50% female?
Amen. You know, I talked about police departments not reflecting the racial diversity of the communities they serve, and they're abhorrent when you think about the gender gaps as well. So I am all for that.
I think we should start with the president.
So it's such a great suggestion. I have very little to add, but let me just say one thing. Your point just picks up on something hugely important. One of the things we do wrong is we sort for the wrong people when we hire police. I mean, just flatly, we start with the wrong place. We sort. I mean, police officers, the one thing we do well is test their psychologies. And we sort for people who want to play warrior, right? And we have all these police officers say, I'm not going to do that. I didn't get into this job to be a social worker. Those people just shouldn't be police officers anymore, right? We need police officers who, from the beginning, take the position, I am here to guard.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Darren, you said earlier that this can be a very fraught conversation, and Cyrus, your answer was, well, this is what I signed up for. But not all of us are elected officials. Exactly. I do think this is a very fraught conversation. And my question to the panel is, do we want for this to continue to be a fraught conversation? Is that a benefit to this, to Black Lives Matter? Or do we want it to be a less fraught conversation, and what would that mean?
Great question, please.
I think I think you make it a less fraught conversation by talking about it. That if something is not talked about, whether it's on the issue of race or anything else in life that we know is a significant problem in our daily lives, then it doesn't get better. So number one, I think you have to be able to talk about it openly, not just a conversation in an office, but obviously a national conversation and conversations groups like this. But then I think combined with that, you have to have policies and practices that address the problem where it occurs, police departments, prosecutors' offices, and elsewhere. So I think you got to talk about it, and then you got to do something about it.
Isn't it also true, though, that I think the gentleman's question is, for the average Joe Blow American, this isn't what they signed up for. I mean, it's what you signed up for. You're an elected official. But how do we, and I would ask Ekow and Kristen, how do we create the space? Because I think that's often a challenge. and again, I'm putting the burden back on we African Americans in this instance, but if a white person says the wrong thing, and we immediately sanction them and publicly ridicule them for saying the wrong word. I was in a meeting recently and I used the term chairman with a group of my feminist colleagues at the Ford Foundation. And I was immediately attacked. And I said, give me a break. I mean, you guys know, I'm just, and so for a minute there I thought, even among, we progressives who are supposed to be so open, the minute a person says the wrong word, we attack and sanction and embarrass and humiliate and send them away from us as opposed to bringing them in to really help solve the problem.
Well, I don't think we should that anyone should have to walk on eggshells. And at the same time, I don't think that you should be afraid of those women who, attack and try to correct you. And in fact, I think that's healthy. That's healthy. We want to have, a space, many spaces where we can air our biases, the explicit biases we harbor, the implicit biases that we don't realize that we harbor, and put them on the table. And I think when we do that, there is the possibility of really moving forward.
I'm not at all sympathetic to you because I don't even make it out of my door without getting this kind of treatment, right? I say all sorts of things, and my wife, who is just as sharp a person as I know, will let me have it. And I've been known to use the phrase, give me a break, more than once. So I understand what you mean. But look, I think like most things, it's two-sided. One part is you have to be brave, right? I mean, some of this requires real courage. You have to say things to your friends that are difficult. You have to disagree with them with goodwill. And I'm so grateful for the friends I know are deeply decent people who disagree with me, because it lets me hear good people of goodwill who disagree with me. And when we have those conversations, it ends up being temporarily painful but long-term helpful. And lastly, I think, to be honest, you have to be willing to listen. Part of the reason some people get so hurt so quickly is because they're so used to other people not listening to them really, right? So, when you think about police violence, look, I do think for a lot of African Americans, it's a little shocking that, a community's been complaining about police violence for something like 100 years, and then there's a video and people say, really? Is this been I mean, in any other relationship, the person would leave you, right? I mean, if your wife kept telling you something all the time and only when she showed you a videotape, you believed her, your relationship, your marriage would be rocky. I think when we have these difficult conversations, we open ourselves up, we go through that pain, we separate, and we come back. You're still going to that boardroom, right? And you're still colleagues and friends, and it ends up healing stronger.
But there's this kind of discipline space, right? And then I think there's something else that we're seeing play out at this moment, and in this election cycle in particular. A lot of bombastic, outright racist, outright hostile and unhealthy, dialogue that I think shows us that we still have so much work to do when it comes to overcoming problems of race. So I just wanted to make sure to flag that. There's kind of this like healthy, disciplined way that we sometimes confront race, but looming over us as we sit here, I think are reminders throughout this election cycle that we're so far from post-racial and that we have so much work to do, I think, to overcome racial inequality and just outright racism.
So we've got two questions here in the middle, please. Thank you. Can both pass your mics to the gentleman there with the...
I wanted to sort of go into the phrase of follow the money. So I understand that in Ferguson, obviously the police, the judges, and the city officials were colluding to extract money from a certain segment of the population to fund essentially the city infrastructure. And when the Justice Department issued a report and tried to come to an agreement, I think the pushback was they couldn't afford the agreement. Why isn't the opposite happening? Why isn't Ferguson facing bankruptcy? Because it has 100,000 civil rights suits against it. And you know, when cars have defects on emissions, that's several $1 billion of payout. Why isn't there a similar payout happening in Ferguson?
Okay. So I feel strongly about it. But I just want to go back to the last question one quick second, because it's not great form to overcompliment people. But there really are public officials like Cyrus Vance who don't duck and hide for cover every time, right? There are people who think, I would rather do something good than just win the next election. And those, you know, when we talk about everyday bravery, that's what we should look for, and we can do that. But on this subject, it's a great question, but I just think people have to know how hard this is. And unlike Hollywood, we shouldn't have to ask for every citizen to be heroic in order for there to be justice. So I don't drive often because I live in Manhattan, but when I drive, I do get pulled over. And getting pulled over, you know, there are days when I get pulled over and I get it, right? There are also days when the cop pulls next to you, looks in your car, drops back behind you, and pulls you over again. And you know what's going on. Now here's the problem. The cop is giving me a ticket. The ticket's $120, right? And yes, I could try to fight or sue. Now, let's say I could fight or sue, but you know what? In 2 weeks, my classes start again. My students are already emailing me. I've got 2 kids under 3 at home. By the way, it's my wedding anniversary, and I'm here, right? I'm very surprised she stays with me, right? Here's the point. I've got a real life going on. I've got a million things to do. And sometimes I still fight these things. And you know what it cost me? It cost me 3 days, typically 3 times as much as the ticket, right? Because I've got to go wherever I was driving, get a hotel room, fight, blah, 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 blah. All the meantime, another million things I have to do aren't getting done, right? Now, and that's me, and I have a huge amount of privilege. I can cancel classes when I want. I can change my schedule. Now, let's say I live in Ferguson, or I work for me, right? I'm my secretary, and so I can't do that quite so easily. It is a lot to ask that I rearrange my whole life to sue Ferguson when, you know, the DA knows a lot of people plead guilty or just pay the ticket because they want to get on with their life. They've got a kid waiting for them at soccer practice, or their wife is giving them the stink eye again, right? Rightfully so. And so I think it's a lot to ask that people heroically sue rather than try to build our institutions to be just from the beginning.
I'm going to have the last question. Peter, let's go.
Thank you very much, panel. You know, I'm listening here, and I was thinking that I'm a reasonably aware person, and yet I learned a lot this afternoon. And I would like to suggest that everybody needs some help, particularly our district attorney. And part of the problem is a cultural issue. We think that we're all aware of the things that you're talking about. And I think that too many of us have lived in a bubble for too long. And in order for us to change the culture, we have to really grasp the reality of the problem. Before we can solve the problem in depth, we have to really grasp it. We have to have the mirror, as you have done, as Darren has done this afternoon, put the mirror right up against our faces as human beings, as citizens of this country, who really aspire to be really great people, and we are much of the time. And I think we really need to accelerate the reality of what has been happening in order for us to better expect the results and the cultural change that is demanded of all of us.
In this moment, panel, this political moment, each of you, are you hopeful? Are you optimistic? If so, why? If not, why? Please, Ekow.
You know, one thing that Obama says, our president says quite often, but I do take it to heart, people have faced worse than this, right? I mean, children marched into fire hoses. And, you know, it's tough. I teach law students. They have been crestfallen over the last few years. Sometimes we're holding them together. I mean, really, they feel powerless. And we tell them, as you just did, no, now's our moment. So, yeah, I'm hopeful. You know, we just saw the thing on the Jet Propulsion Lab. We really see what we can do when we're at the best of us, right? And surely we've done better. Thank you.
I'm optimistic but vigilant. I believe that our nation can be a better place. I believe that we must overcome the issues that divide us: race, gender, religion, national origin. But I know that we also have to be vigilant, because there are efforts all around us to turn the clock back. We know that the progress we've made is fragile. Vote suppression is alive and well. We're seeing it at the state level. We're seeing it at the local level. I think that the stakes are very high this election cycle, and that we'll have to do great work to make sure that we're continuing to, move forward and make progress.
So I am very hopeful, and I think I will live and work in a world which is filled with bad stories and sad stories, but I remain very hopeful on the broader issue of race and an improvement in criminal justice and fairness. But as I think the questioner remarked, if our citizens and those who represent the citizens don't address the issue, if we are not able to talk about it, if we're not able to put it on the table, then I think the price we will pay is the price you pay when you avoid any problem, is it comes back and haunts you and hits you later harder. So if we deal with this in an open way, I'm very hopeful. And I think there is great commonality across race, across in the communities that I go to, the lawyers that I meet. I think people want to find a way to be able to talk about this and deal with this. And I think that's a majority of people, not a minority of people.
Well, I think that we would all agree that we are hopeful. In fact, I believe that the greatest threat to our democracy is not terrorism. The greatest threat to our democracy is hopelessness. And I think we all feel a little more hopeful after hearing from these three remarkable people. Please join me in welcoming and thanking them.
Thank you. Thank you, Darren. Thank you.